The fluorescent lights of corporate headquarters buzzed overhead as I stood in the corner of the conference room, feeling like a fish out of water. At age 56, I was about to experience one of the most memorable moments of my life, though not exactly in the way I had anticipated. The welcome party had been arranged in the largest conference room on the executive floor. Crystal glasses clinked as people chatted, their voices echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city skyline. I couldn't help but think how different this was from the factory floor where I'd spent most of my working life. The smell of expensive cologne and perfume replaced the familiar scent of machine oil and metal that had been my companion for decades. A group of executives huddled near the refreshment table, stealing glances my direction while pretending to be engrossed in conversation. Their designer suits and polished shoes spoke a world of where I was only beginning to understand. I adjusted my own suit jacket, not quite as expensive as theirs, but clean and pressed with care. James Wilson, the department manager, spotted me from across the room. His expensive suit and perfectly coiffed hair exuded an air of superiority as he sauntered over. The sharp tap of his Italian leather shoes against the polished floor announced his approach before his voice did.
Everyone! May I have your attention?
He called out, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt.
Let me introduce you to our small-town dropout. You can sit at the far end of the table.
The room fell silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably, while others pretended to be deeply interested in their drinks. I felt my face grow hot, but years of experience had taught me to keep my expression neutral. A young executive near me suddenly became fascinated with his shoelaces, while his colleague developed an intense interest in her smartphone. Wilson wasn't done yet. He circled around me like a shark sensing blood in the water.
What do you say? I can barely understand that thick accent of yours,
he exclaimed with exaggerated confusion.
This is what happens when you get someone from the sticks. Speak proper English, will you?
His laughter bounced off the walls, sharp and cruel. A few others joined in with nervous chuckles, more out of obligation than genuine amusement. The sound reminded me of the schoolyard taunts from my childhood, but I was no longer that vulnerable boy. Wilson moved closer, his cologne overwhelming in its intensity.
Someone with no education belongs at the far end of the table.
He gestured dramatically, playing to his audience.
We'll order you some mashed potatoes. That's probably all you country folk eat anyway. Oh wait, can you even understand what I'm saying?
He gave me a rough shove towards the far end of the conference table, his manicured hand pressing against my shoulder. I stumbled slightly but caught myself, my hands clenched into fist at my side. The anger that bubbled up inside me was familiar. I felt it many times before in my life. But I learned to control it, to channel into something more productive. The rural wool of my mother's sweater beneath my suit jacket reminded me of how far I'd come. A middle-aged woman in a navy blazer winced visibly at Wilson's behavior, but quickly averted her eyes when I glanced her way. The clink of ice and crystal glasses punctuated the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the room. As I made my way to my assigned seat, I could feel the weight of everyone's stares. Some looked sympathetic, others embarrassed, but none spoke up. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Wilson's continued snickering and the soft whirl of the building's ventilation system. That's when the click of heels against the polished floor announced a new arrival. Sarah Parker, the executive assistant, stepped into the room with a grace that seemed to part the tension like a knife through butter. Her professional demeanor and kind eyes took in the scene before her. Unlike the others, there was no trace of embarrassment or feigned ignorance in her expression, only a quiet determination that immediately commanded attention. "Isn't there something wrong with the seating arrangement?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "Because..." She paused, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing look that would soon turn this entire situation on its head. "My name is David Thompson, and at 56 years old, I've learned that life has a way of bringing you full circle." As I sat there at the end of the conference table watching Wilson's smug expression, my mind drifted back to where it all began, to the small town that had shaped me, for better or worse. My hometown wasn't just rural, it was the kind of place city folks might mistake for being stuck in time. The gravel roads kicked up dust in the summer and turned to mud in the spring. The nearest convenience store was a luxury we couldn't afford to think about, and the grocery store was a 20-minute drive away in what passed for our local strip mall, a collection of weather-beaten buildings that had seen better days decades ago. Our house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, its white paint peeling and gray with age. The porch creaked under every step, and the screen door had a distinctive squeak that announced everyone's comings and goings. But it was home, and my mother had worked hard to make it feel that way, even after Dad was gone. For us kids, entertainment made making our own fun in the woods, or splashing around in the creek that wound through the outskirts of town. There weren't any playgrounds or parks. Nature was our playground, and we made the most of it. My brothers and I spent countless hours building forts from fallen branches, having stick sword fights and creating elaborate games that only we understood. I was the eldest of 3 brothers, a position that came with both privileges and responsibilities. Michael, 2 years younger than me, was the quiet one, always with his nose in a book borrowed from the school library. Stephen, the baby of the family, was all energy and laughter, forever trailing after us bigger boys, determined not to be left behind. They looked up to me, and I tried my best to be the role model they needed. We were a typical family, or so I thought, until the day everything changed. It happened when Stephen had just started elementary school. One ordinary Tuesday morning, we received a phone call that would alter the course of our lives forever. Dad, who spent most of his time working construction jobs out of state, had suffered a sudden heart attack. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. I remember standing in our small kitchen when Mom got the call. She was wearing her faded blue waitress uniform, getting ready to leave for her morning shift at the local diner. The phone's ring seemed louder than usual that morning, cutting through the routine sounds of breakfast, the scrape of cereal spoons against bowls, Michael asking about his math homework, Stephen's cartoon playing softly on our old TV. Mom answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Her voice was cheerful, normal. Then everything changed. I watched as the color drained from her face, her hand gripping the wall phone so tightly, her knuckles turned white. No, it can't be right. Are you sure? The funeral was a blur of black suits and sympathetic murmurs. Our small church was packed with people from town, faces I knew from the grocery store, the post office, the school. The air was thick with perfume of funeral flowers and the whispered conversations of adults who thought we couldn't hear them.
Such a shame, those poor boys.
How was she managed on her own?
Did they have any insurance?
I sat in the front pew, sandwiched between Michael and Stephen, all of us in ill-fitting suits borrowed from the church's donation box. Mom sat rigid beside us, her face hidden behind a black veil that couldn't quite conceal her red-rimmed eyes. At the time, it didn't feel real. Maybe because Dad had been away so much that his absence didn't immediately feel different. But reality has a way of creeping up on you, and by the time I reached 8th grade, its weight had become unbearable. The changes came gradually at first. Mom took extra shifts at the diner, then a second job at the grocery store. She'd leave before dawn and return long after dark, her feet swollen from hours of standing, but still managing to ask about our homework and make sure we eat in dinner. Our lunchboxes told the story of our family's decline. Where once there had been carefully packed bentos of a variety of dishes, Mom had learned to make them from Miss Chen next door. Now there was just plain rice and a few pickled vegetables. The transformation wasn't just in the food, but in everything around us. The grass grew a little longer between cuttings, the laundry piled up a little higher, and the silence at the dinner table grew a little deeper. At first, my classmates, the same ones I'd grown up with, showed their concern through shared lunches and worried glances. Katie Martinez was slipping half her sandwich when the teacher wasn't looking. Mark Anderson would accidentally bring extra snacks and insist he couldn't eat them all. But children can be cruel without meaning to be, and soon the teasing began. I still remember the day it all came to a head. It was early October, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves through the open classroom windows. Tommy Chen, someone I once considered a friend, whose mother had taught mine to make those bentos, held up his lunch with exaggerated pride. His new designer lunchbox gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to my own worn paper bag.
Hey, David, want some of this meat?
He called out across the classroom, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of mockery and false generosity that only teenagers can perfect.
Poor people like you probably couldn't afford meat, right?
Classroom fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes turned to watch, waiting to see how I would react. I could feel the heat rising in my face and my hands beginning to shake. Tommy had been my friend since kindergarten. We played together, studied together, shared countless meals at each other's houses. And now, something inside me snapped. Years of pent-up frustration, grief, and shame exploded in a single moment. My chair scrapped against the floor as I stood, the sound eerily loud in the silent room. 3 steps brought me to Tommy's desk. My fist connected with his face before I even realized I'd moved. The sound of his chair clattering to the floor seemed to echo through the suddenly silent classroom. Tommy sprawled on the ground, his hand covering his nose, blood seeping between his fingers. His expensive lunchbox lay forgotten on the floor, its contents scattered across the linoleum. The look of shock and betrayal in his eyes was almost worse than the fear. "Mr. Thompson!" Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the silence like a whip crack. "Principal's office! Now!" As I walked down the empty hallway to the principal's office, my knuckles stinging and my heart pounding, I could hear the whispers starting behind me. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. That punch did more than just break Tommy's nose. It shattered whatever remained of my normal school life. The isolation that followed wasn't just about being excluded from games or group projects. It was a complete social exile. The other kids didn't just avoid me. They treated me like I was contagious, as if poverty and violence could spread through casual contact. Whispered rumors followed me through the hallways, and what started as teasing evolved into something more malicious. Books would mysteriously disappear from my desk, only to reappear in the trash. My gym shoes would go missing before class, turning up later filled with water. Someone carved "poor boy" into my desk one day. I spent an hour after school sanding it off while the janitor pretended not to notice. The teachers weren't much better. They'd grown up in the same small town, known my father, watched our families decline. Their pity was almost worse than the students' cruelty. They'd give me passing grades even when I hadn't done the work, speak to me in soft, careful voices as if I might explode again at any moment. All except Mr. Reynolds. He was the only one who still treated me like a normal student, still expected me to do the work, still called on me in class even when everyone else had written me off. The worst part wasn't the bullying, it was the way it affected my mother. The call from my teacher brought her to tears, though she tried to hide it when she spoke to me that evening. She found me in our small kitchen, angrily doing homework by the light of our flickering fluorescent bulb. The ancient refrigerator hummed in the background, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice thick of emotion. Her work uniform was wrinkled from a double shift, and there were new gray strands in her hastily tied back hair. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights. "For making things difficult for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here was my mother, who I barely saw anymore because she was always working, apologizing to me? She who had raised 3 boys alone, who worked herself to exhaustion at a run-down grocery store just to keep food on our table? The unfairness of it all made my blood boil. "Shut up!" I shouted, immediately regretting the words but too proud to take them back. The hurt in her eyes would haunt me for years to come. She flinched as if I struck her, and in that moment, I felt even worse than I had after hitting Tommy. Michael and Stephen appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. Stephen, still in his pajamas with a worn knee, clutched his stuffed bear, the last birthday gift Dad had given him. Michael stood slightly in front of him, protective as always, his face a mask of confusion and concern. The moment in the kitchen marked a turning point. The mixture of emotions I felt then, anger, sadness, shame, and a deep, gnawing emptiness, became my constant companions. It was like carrying a heavy stone in my chest that grew larger with each passing day. I stopped eating lunch at school altogether. Couldn't bear to face the cafeteria with its judging eyes and whispered comments. Instead, I spent the lunch hour in the library, pretending to study while my stomach growled. When parent-teacher conference time came around, I wasn't surprised that my mother couldn't attend. She was working extra shifts at the grocery store, trying to make up for co-workers' illness. The school hallways were filled with other families, mothers in nice dresses, fathers in clean work shirts, all of them discussing their children's bright futures, while I sat alone in the classroom, pretending not to care. My teacher, Mr. Reynolds, tried his best to be understanding. He pulled up a chair next to my desk, his kind eyes meeting mine without a trace of pity that I'd grown to hate.
"I had a phone conference with your mother, so it's fine,"
he said, attempting to sound cheerful.
"Study hard and aim for high school, David. You have potential."
His words rang hollow in my ears. High school? More studying? The mere thought of it made me want to scream. What was the point of spending 3 more years being the poor kid, the one everyone pitied or mocked? The one wearing secondhand uniforms and bringing rice-only lunches, when I brought lunch at all? That evening, I made my decision. The walk home from school felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of what I was about to do. The autumn wind rustled through the nearly bare trees, carrying with the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. I found my mother in our tiny living room, mending one of my younger brother's school uniforms by the dim light of our old table lamp. The needle flashed in her tired hands, catching what little light there was. "I'm not going to high school," I announced without preamble, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. She looked up from her sewing, the needle frozen mid-stitch. The dark circles under her eyes seemed even more pronounced in the weak lamplight. "What? Why not?" "I want to work." "Please go to high school," she pleaded, setting aside her mending. The threadbare sleeve of Stephen's uniform dangled forgotten from her lap. "Are you worried about money?" "Yeah, that's right." My voice rose with each word, echoing off the water-stained walls. "Instead of wasting 3 years being miserable and poor in high school, I could be working, making money, actually helping this family instead of being another mouth to feed." "David, please." She reached for me, but I stepped back, bumping into the bookshelf where Dad's old fishing magazine still sat, gathering dust. "Let me do what I want!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'll even send money home!" The factory that would become my home for the next several decades stood like a fortress on the outskirts of a neighboring town. It was a sprawling complex of metal and concrete, Steam rising from its stacks into the gray morning sky. The constant hum of machinery vibrated through the ground, a mechanical heartbeat that never ceased. The employee dormitories were simple but clean, a far cry from the cramped quarters I left behind. The morning I left home, my mother pressed an envelope into my hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held it out, and I noticed the small cuts and calluses that years of work had left on them. The early morning light streaming through her kitchen window caught the silver strands in her hair. When had those appeared? "This is for your train fare and meals," she said softly. The envelope was worn at the edges, as if she held it many times before working up the courage to give it to me. I took it without a word, having already asked her to prepare this much. The weight of the envelope felt heavy in my pocket, laden with more than just money. I knew she must have worked extra shifts to save this much. "All right, I'm off," I mumbled, adjusting the strap on my worn duffel bag. Everything I owned fitted into that single bag. Some clothes, a few photographs, and a notebook I never admit to keeping. "Call any time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She twisted her apron in her hands, a nervous habit I'd seen countless times before. "Come visit sometimes." Yeah, I'm going now. I walked to the bus stop without looking back, though every step felt like lead. The morning was cool, mist clinging to the ground like reluctant memories. As the bus pulled away, I caught a glimpse of my mother in the rearview mirror, still standing where I'd left her, a small figure growing smaller until she disappeared completely. Michael and Steven weren't there. I insisted on leaving before they woke up. I couldn't bear to see their faces. My first day at the factory was a sensory overload. The cacophony of machinery was deafening. The rhythmic pounding of stamping machines, the whine of conveyor belts, the hiss of pneumatic tools. The air was thick of the smell of metal shavings and industrial lubricant. Workers moved with practiced efficiency, their movements almost choreographed through the years of repetition. The factory work was hard, but I threw myself into it with determination. My hands grew calloused, my muscles ached, but there was a satisfaction in the tangible results of my labor. Each completed part was proof that I was contributing, earning my way. My supervisor, Robert Miller, became more than just a boss. He became the mentor I didn't know I needed. He was a man in his 50s, with steel gray hair and hands that bore the scars of decades in the industry. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his wisdom cut through my teenage stubbornness like a knife through butter. One particularly frustrating day, after I botched a series of complex assemblies trying to do things my own way, Miller called me into his office. The room was small, with windows that looked out over the factory floor. The walls were covered in the technical drawings and production charts, each one telling its own story of progress and setbacks. A half-empty coffee cup sat at his desk, the surface ringed with the stain of countless refills.
"Sit down, David,"
he said, gesturing to a chair while he leaned against his desk. His voice was gruff but not unkind.
"Tell me, why do you think we make these parts?"
The question caught me off guard. I stared at my hands, still smudged with machine oil, despite my attempts to clean them. "Because that's our job?" I answered uncertainly. Miller shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He picked up one of the parts I'd been working on, a small but intricate piece of machinery.
"Look at this component, David. What do you see?"
I looked at the metal piece, turning it over in my mind. Transmission gear?
"That's what it is, yes. What I see is part of someone's morning commute to work, part of a family's vacation, part of a delivery truck bringing food to a grocery store."
I set the part down carefully.
Everything's connected, David. We make things because people appreciate them. We make them so people will be happy. It's the same with our coworkers. And we work to make things easier for each other. You've been too focused on doing things your own way. You'll never become a true craftsman like that. Everything is connected.